Καλησπέρα σας, κυρίες και κύριοι. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Swedish Institute once more for an Aegean lecture. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to be able to present Dimitra Mylona as tonight's speaker, as she's a colleague and also former employee of the Swedish Institute, but also a dear old friend. Dimitra, she grew up in a village called Musteni, that is near Kavala in the eastern Macedonia. She studied archaeology at the universities of Crete, Sheffield, and Southampton. And at the same time, she studied animal bone assemblages from many different sites in Greece. They are innumerable, so I don't mention any of them. It's maybe best so. She defended her doctoral thesis on fish and fishermen in ancient Greece in 2007. And her thesis was published in the Bar series and has ever since been the basic work on this topic. And at this time, Dimitra already had a postdoctoral position waiting at the Swedish Institute's research program, The Sea, the City and the God, which focused on the sanctuary of Poseidon at Calabria on the island of Poros. She was employed in the Swedish program till the end of 2012 and has since held a research position at the Institute of Aegean Prehistory in Eastern Crete. Today, I dare to say that Dimitra is one of the authorities in the field that is called environmental archaeology or bioarchaeology, and not only in Greece, but in the wider Mediterranean region. She's not an osteologist who writes reports on animal bones, but an archaeologist who studies animal bones and other bioarchaeological remains in their historical and social contexts. Her research questions often concern diet during various epochs in antiquity, but she has also approached the topic on a more symbolic level, the very relation between man and animal. Her speech tonight focuses on the island of Mochlos in eastern Crete during the Neopalatial period. Welcome, please. Is this?
I think they are on. Huh? That's it?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Λοιπόν, the seminar today is about the animal remains from Mochlos, and we will talk about issues of economy and food choices in the Neopalatial period. Let me start with some orientation observations. Mochlos is a tiny island on the eastern Crete, in the Mirabello Bay. It is only 200 meters off the Cretan coast and is a swimming distance away. In the Neopalatial period, it was actually not an island, but a small peninsula that was joined to the Cretan coast by a narrow ribbon of land. The island is almost totally covered by remains of buildings that date from 3100 BC up to the Byzantine era. Habitation was not continuous. Most of the visible remains, however, date to the Bronze Age. At that time, that settlement was a flourishing harbor town which spilled over to the Cretan coast as well. It was not only on the peninsula. The animal remains that I will present today have been collected from 14 buildings, 3 plataeas, 3 open spaces, and some passageways. Chronology-wise, the material dates to the Neopalatial period from around 1700 to 1430 BC, more or less. This had been a turbulent historical period for Crete, and this is reflecting in the changing shape of the settlement. On the basis of its shifting architecture and on pottery changes, there can be discerned 3 different subphases in the Neopalatial. The earlier transitional phase, which ends with a destruction, and from that earlier phase we only have restricted deposits excavated, so there is not much material from that. Then we have the late Mylona 1A. Sorry, I wrote it wrong there. This phase ends with the eruption of the Theron volcano, and then we have the late Mylona 1B, which is the most prominent phase, the most visible phase, let's say, on Mochlos. With, this has the most abundant remains, more buildings, more finds, and it ends with a destruction as well. The archaeological remains, in other words, remains of animals found in archaeological strata. We are talking about mammal bones, about 14,000 of them, fish bones, about 900 of them, mollusks, 10,000 of them, and microfaunal remains, that is remains of mice, lizards, shrews, and the like. Microfaunal remains are studied by Katerina Papagiannis, and we'll not talk about them today. The mollusks, I should tell you that many of them have been recorded by David Rees, and I want to thank him for that. Taking into account the huge number of remains and the very variable origin of these remains, and the fact that they come from different chronological horizons, it's clear that their analysis was complex. And it was done on these 4 levels. First, identification and recording of the bones. And then the remains were analyzed by chronological phase in the standard zooarchaeological way, asking questions like what was the relative importance of the various species, the estimation of the animal's age at death, patterns of carcass utilization, markers for food preparation and consumption. These are the things that were examined. As a next step, all these materials were discussed in relation to the houses, to the rooms, and to the floors where they were found in, and in relation to other finds from the same spaces. And finally, a contextualization was attempted, geographical, temporal, other. We'll see at the end of this presentation. Today, I will try to give you an overview, and I will also try to highlight a few of the issues that came up as a result of this analysis. And let's start with the first step, identification and recording. First, we have the mammals. Most of the remains, unsurprisingly, are from sheep and goat. Because the bones of these 2 animals are very similar, especially when they are broken up, the archaeologists have come up with a very bizarre species, which is called an ovicaprid. When we talk about ovicaprids, we mean that we are not sure whether they are sheep or goat, and I'll talk a lot about this animal. There were pig remains, very little cattle, very little dog remains. As of wild mammals, hardly anything. Actually, there are only 2 bones, 2 goat bones, which are big enough to be considered wild goats, but there are too many questions there. It's not certain. And I should tell you here that even the birds and other wild species are very rare. Just a handful of bones. Let's move to the fish. Here you have a numerical presentation of what I just described. Just pay attention to cattle and dogs and see how few of these remains have been identified among the 14,000. Let's move to the fish. Here things are quite different. In this table you see the range of the identified species. You see that it's much longer than the mammals, and if you look at the back of at the end of the table in this area here, we have all these indeterminate fish. What it actually means is that they could not be identified because my reference collection was not adequate, and that means that in that group there, more species are hidden. And here is a more visual representation of the same thing. And what you see actually is that we have bones from very large fish and bones like, like this, and bones from very small fish, like this. Then we have the mollusks. Again, the variety is huge. If you see here, I'm giving you the genus name for each one of them, not the species name, and that means again that this list could be much, much longer. I have divided the marine mollusks in two categories, the edible and the non-edible. And when I say non-edible, actually I mean either species which are poisonous and you cannot actually eat them, like the conch shell, or species which are too small. You see that among the marine mollusks, the ones which are marked red are the most common. The ones which are red are the ones which are present with more than 100 individuals, and some of them more than 1,000 individuals. The ones which are blue, we found them scattered widely, so they were caught, but their numbers are fairly small, less than 100. And then we have all the rest, the ones in black, which are present with 1 or 2 individuals each. And let's have a visual on the mollusks. The 3 top are the most common ones, and the rest are the most common of the edible species. Many of them are familiar, I'm sure. And here we have the most common non-edible species. There is not a scale here in this picture, but with the exception of the conch shell, this one, this is the conch shell, all the others are tiny. They are smaller than 1 centimeter in length. So this is pretty much what was brought and consumed or used in the settlement on this peninsula. And from this presentation, 3 issues are important. One is the absence of game animals. The second is the scarcity of cattle and dog remains. And the third is this marked antithesis between the narrow range of the mammals and the huge variety of the marine animals. Let's move to the next level of analysis, the analysis by chronological phase. And let's start again with the mammals. Ovicaprids. If you look at this table, you see that ovicaprids as a group, and this is the numbers here in parentheses, they remain stable throughout the Neopalatial. There are not significant differences between the subphases. But if we look at the percentages of sheep and goat, we realize that over the time there has been a shift in the importance of the 2 species. In the earlier, in the earlier phase, sheep are much more important than goats, and in the latest phase, sheep again gain prominence. In the late Mylona 1, the difference is not that big between sheep and goats. We leave the pigs aside for the moment, and let's see what happens with cattle. You see that it seems that cattle was not consumed at all in the earliest phase of the Neopalatial, very little in late Mylona 1A, and there is some, but again very low consumption at late Mylona 1B, and we'll come back to that phenomenon later. The same with dog. Dog is present only in the latest phase. I'm sorry, I don't know what I did. Dogs were an important animal because it was useful for many reasons, as a hunting aid, for the protection of the herds, but it was also a food animal. People were eating it. in the last years, more and more evidence towards that is coming to light, and Mochlos is one of the sites that moves the limit to dog eating into the late Mylona 1b. Fish seem to be, you see here that there are many more fish remains in the late Mylona 1b, much fewer in the earlier phases. This is something that does not reflect the actual scarcity of fish in the earlier phases. The earlier phases produced less material because the extent of the excavation was smaller. What you see in the lower row here is that there is variety. This variety is standard throughout the Neopalatial period. And this is also true for the mollusks, the marine mollusks. Again, you see the variety. You see here. Something worth mentioning about the mollusks is that we have this very rare find here. We found 2 freshwater mollusks, 2 freshwater mussels actually. And that's something remarkable because nowadays freshwater mussels do not exist on Crete. Back to the sheep and goats. Let's look them at more detail. I told you already that the relative importance of the 2 species changes over time. That means that for some reason, people chose to change their eating preferences and also their animal herding practices over time. The interesting question is why? Why did they do that? I should tell you here that in zooarchaeology, we make some basic assumptions. One is that the bones of the domestic animals that we find on a site, and which are usually food wastes, actually reflect more or less the living population of these animals in the area. This assumption has some problems, of course, but it works well when we deal with long-term trends. To be able to talk about herding strategies and economic priorities on economic priorities on the part of the pastoralists, we rely rather heavily on ethnography. In other words, we observe what recent herders do and why, and we use these observations as a guiding framework within which we interpret the zooarchaeological data. And although we tend to imagine situations like this are also relevant. Based on ethnographic work among pastoralists in Anatolia, Sebastian Payne formulated a model, later elaborated by other researchers. According to this model, the age at death in a herd and the pace by which the herd is culled indicates the pastoralist's economic interests and priorities. If, for example, you breed a herd of sheep aiming to meat production, then you keep your animals, your newborn animals, until they are fully developed, and you slaughter them. You slaughter them then. You don't keep them for longer because that's uneconomical. It's not economical. If you are interested in milk production, then you do slaughter the new kids early on because they compete with you for the milk. If you're interested in wool, then you keep all the animals that are born in your flocks until an advanced age, until their wool quality drops, and then you slaughter them. And because the kids that are born in a flock are both male and female, and you cannot really keep many males in a herd because they are very aggressive, you castrate them. In theory, we should be able to detect such breeding practices archaeologically by calculating the animal's age at death. And that's something that can be done. Of course, in reality, things are never as clear-cut as in a model, and a herder might have multiple economic priorities. Nevertheless, experience has shown that it is possible for the archaeologists to discern different trends in different assemblages, and we actually have several means to ensure that we can produce at least some tentative but reliable interpretations. And let's go back to Mochlos. What was the age and sex of the ovicabrids brought and consumed on site? The age at death can be estimated by the state of the eruption and wear of the animal's dentition. This one. And also by the state of the epiphysis of the bone's ends. I will spare you the technical details here, and we'll go straight to the results of this analysis. Such data on the age at death, are expressed as survivorship curves, like the ones I show you here. Here we have two such graphs. The first one, the top one, is for sheep, and the lower one is for goats. What we see in these graphs is that, as far as sheep are concerned, is that about 30%, about 70% of the herd survives to the age of 1 year here. And then not many animals are slaughtered until the age of 3 to 4 to 4 to 6, this area here. And then many animals are slaughtered together when they reach this age. And then again, the pace of culling stops. What we see here is an interest to keep the animals, the adult animals, for a long period. And that fits very well to the model for wool production. When we see the goat graph, we see that in the first few years, the culling is more gradual. But again, when we reach at this age, 3 to 4 and 4 to 6 years, we have a very abrupt drop. Many animals were slaughtered at this age. What these two curves tell us is that the herding of sheep and goat were following different trajectories, but they were meeting at some point. For some reason, when the animals reached that age, 4 to 6 years, they were slaughtered. And let's see another survivorship curve. This one is for ovicaprids, both sheep and goat, and it's based on epiphysis fusion. Because this graph is based on mixed data, it has some problems, but it also helps us a lot because it elaborates on the first few years in the life of the animals in a herd. What we see here is that there is an episode of serious slaughtering at the age between 1 and 1.5 to 1.5 and 2.5, this one here. Keep in mind that the sheep and goat give birth for the first time when they are about 1 year old. So what we see here, this drop, this slaughtering, happened on animals that had already given birth at least once. And this may be interesting, and I'll tell you later why. But compare that graph with this graph. This is the same thing for goats. Let's see them together. Where in sheep we have this gradual drop with this episode here. No, I'm sorry, this is again for ovicaprids. The first graph is again for ovicaprids, but it's the late Mylona 1A. This one is late Mylona 1B. You see that in late Mylona 1A, the breeding of the ovicaprids had different aims altogether. They were slaughtering a lot of the animals until within the first year, before they gave birth, just when they completed their body development. This fits very well with the model for meat production. So again, we see these different interests over time. The priorities for sheep and goat breeding changed over time within the Neopalatial. To summarize this data, we have seen that there was a differentiation in the way sheep and goats were managed on the same temporal horizon, but there was also a differentiation. The ovicaprids were managed over time. Let's move to the next animal, the pigs. For the pigs, we see that there was an emphasis on pigs in the earlier phase of the Neopalatial, over here, and then their presence, their importance was steady. An interesting observation is that in the late Minoan 1A, remember that was the period when sheep and goats were bred for their meat, the pigs were slaughtered very young. In the other periods, we have a variety of ages. They were consuming newborns and senile animals together. This, oh, I'm sorry. This fact, the fact that they were eating animals of all ages, might be an indirect indication that the breeding of the pigs was small scale and perhaps of a domestic scale, but we'll discuss it later. The data on cattle is very scant. If we pull together all the late Minoan 1B cattle remains, they represent at least 2 individuals, and both of them are at their prime. They are young adults. Now, that's what we observed on the mammal bones. Moving to the fish. These are the most commonly consumed fish in Neopalatial Mochlos, and in fact, in all Bronze Age sites of the southern Aegean. Pickerels, marides, these ones. Pickerel are marides. Boobs are the bogs. Wrasses, honey, and damselfish, which are calogriches. These are small fish, smaller than 10 centimeters in length. They are schooling fish, which are found in the shallows among the rocks. If you go snorkeling in the summer, these are some of the fish that you are going to see, like this. Here are their bones. Their bones are tiny. We find their remains. We usually find their remains scattered all over the place. Because these are small fish, very often they are eaten whole, and their bones are small and fragile. So the few bones that we find in these species, the small species, are usually very seriously underrepresented in excavations. That means that the few bones that we find do not really reflect the intensity by which they were consumed. Then we have these fish here. We are familiar with them as big fish in the fish market, very desirable fish. But at Mochlos, we have all these as babies when they are very small. And in this graph here, this graph is based on the measurements of the fish otoliths, the ear bone of the fish. What you see here is that we have a variety of species, both small and large in their real life, but they are all concentrated here in the small sizes area of the graph. That means that they are all babies. They are all small, not all small. They are all small. Some of them are the baby big fish, and some of them are the small fish. Now, I'm making a big story out of it because these are the fish that find those big fish live a solitary life in the deep water. When they are small, however, they find refuge in the shallow waters of the coast just because there are lots of nutrients and the big predators cannot reach them. That's why we find them all together. And this is a very good indication that the fishermen, that the fishing for them was done in the shallows. Like this, or like this. But of course, these fish, the familiar ones, are also found in Mochlos as big individuals, and some of them are actually reaching their maximum length. That means that they are very old individuals. The remains of these fish are found concentrated in specific spaces within specific rooms, in contrast to the small ones, which were found scattered all over the place. The capture of these fish is a more tricky business than the capture of the small ones, because these are creatures of the deeper waters. So in order to catch them, you have to know how to do it. It means that you have to have the knowledge. It involves a whole set of other skills. And we'll return to that a bit later on. The marine mollusks actually provide... sorry, I forgot to show you the pictures. The marine mollusks provide exactly the same picture. We have marine mollusks of the very shallow waters. These creatures here, they can be picked without even knowing how to swim. You don't need to have tools to pick them. But then there are these creatures here. We have several seashells at Mochlos. Most of them are large, which are different, and they are different for two reasons. These can be found in the shallows, but if you want to have large numbers of them, you have to go deeper. And people in Bronze Age Crete wanted to have large numbers of them. The first one, this one is a purple shell. Purple dye became a very important economic activity from Middle Mylona onwards. That was a totally new technology that appeared at that time. And to produce purple dye, you need masses of these creatures. This is a spiny oyster. Its purple color makes it very attractive, and because it's a thick shell, it was often used to manufacture small items like beads. This is a pen shell. It has an iridescent interior, and it was used to make inlays. And this is a Triton shell that was widely used either as modified, either as a tool or as a ceremonial vessel. So in order for fishermen to acquire these creatures here, they had to dive deep. At Mochlos, we have not actually found any workshops for the modification of these shells. We have found the modified shells, but excavations in other parts of Crete, contemporary to Mochlos, have revealed such workshops, both for the production of purple dye and for the manufacture of Triton objects. Before we take all these observations and see what they mean in the wider context of the Neopalatial economy and the Neopalatial society, let's look at the zooarchaeological material from a different angle. I just wanted to tell you, never mind. Let's see the animal remains in relation to the houses, to the rooms and the floors for its chronological phase. At Mochlos, not all excavated buildings are as fully excavated and recorded, and this is because the excavation of the Neopalatial strata began in the early 20th century, and since then it has been done under different research agendas over the years, and also some of these buildings have been destroyed over the centuries, either by way of auctions for those buildings which are near the sea, or by subsequent building on the same spot. Finally, not all the buildings were as big and as wealthy. In other words, the picture we gain from our analysis is certainly influenced by taphonomy and chance, but certain things are clearly reflecting past actions. And this discussion is rather complicated. You follow it much easier when it's written. So here I will give you a couple of examples just to show you the type of analysis. We'll focus on building C3, the so-called house of the metal merchant. This is the house where a couple of metal hoards, very rich metal hoards, were found. In the late Minoan 1B phase, this house was arranged around clusters of rooms. If we look at these rooms here, the vestibule, room 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3, the vestibule and room 2.1 were almost empty of animal remains. Room 2.2, this had two late Minoan 1B floors. On the upper floor, several stone tools and a big quern were found, a few cooking vessels, but hardly any animal remains, very few. On the floor beneath it, again late Minoan 1B floor, the mammal bones were few, but there were several seashells, and most of them were edible. They were limpets. And on this horizon, we also found charcoal, lots of fish. It's clearly a horizon with food remains. Then, let's move to room 2-3. There we had many cookpots with clear traces of use, burning marks and the like. But although these finds would tell us that this was a kitchen, actually we didn't find, we found very, very few animal remains in that space. On the contrary, when we moved to this cluster of rooms here, this cluster was added to the building at the beginning of late Minoan 1B, then the picture is totally different. Apart from this room, the room 1-5, which was almost empty, all other rooms were extremely rich in faunal remains. Room 1-4, very many mammal remains, some mollusks, several fish bones, many cooking pots, many eating and drinking vessels. The same with room 1-6, and I will elaborate a little on room 1-6 because it's quite interesting. The uppermost late Minoan 1B floor, we have seashells, but not as many as we find elsewhere. They are mostly limpets. But we find very many fish bones. They are from large fish. We have the whole skeleton, both head and postcranial bones. They are burnt on spots, and they are not weathered or broken or anything. They are very well preserved. This looks very much like primary waste disposal, which has not been disturbed after it was deposited. The same is the situation with the mammal bones. They are plentiful, very well preserved. And when we count the bones, we have the remains of at least 1 cattle, 3 pigs, and 10 ovicaprids. And among the ovicaprids, males and females are represented in equal numbers. All parts of the ovicaprid skeletons are present in this sub-assemblage on this floor. Actually, we find bones with cut marks on them, and most of the cut marks are chopping marks. And the chopping, this abrupt movement we do with a heavy cutting tool, is aimed to cut the bone, to break it, to cut it in small portions. We observed that the carcasses of all species were brought in the kitchen, in this kitchen, cooked and eaten, already cut in pieces. This job was not done there. On the lower floor, the same room, same spot, on the lower floor, we have a similar picture. Lots of mammal bones, lots of fish bones, lots of mollusks. The difference here is that there was a hearth on this floor level, and that's why the bones were more heavily burned. And this is an interesting observation because it shows us that the fire was used as a way to clean up the space. It was a way to manage waste. And we should keep that in mind when we look at material from domestic spaces. The conclusions we reach is that in these rooms, we have food waste. Their accumulation was not gradual. These wastes were not exposed to weathering and trampling or to predator action, like dogs, for example. They had not been swept before they were covered, and some fire was involved in their management before their final deposition. So, in essence, we have food waste, which involved large quantities of meat from some commensal activity that took part just before the room was abandoned or the floors became obsolete. And that's interesting. Concentrations like this of well-preserved material which represent these final few meals within the houses are found in other buildings as well. And these stand out. And they sit on top of a wide spread of animal remains which are found everywhere, and these are totally different. These are small bones of various species, small mollusks. They are broken, they are eroded, they are of small size, of small taxonomic variety, small anatomical variety. This is the stuff that lies around and people step on them, the animals chew on them, they get worked and reworked in the soil in the settlement. So these two groups, they don't have the same interpretational value, of course. And the interesting question, coming near the closure of this seminar, is what do we learn from bones and the mollusks about the Neopalatial economy and food consumption at Mochlos? Let's start again with the ovicaprids. This is a list of the most important products an ovicaprid, a sheep or a goat, provides: meat, wool or hair, hides, manure, milk, and bones and tendons. Raw materials for tools. We have several bone tools at Mochlos. We haven't located any workshop for them. Milk. Now, the milk is a ghost product archaeologically, very difficult to detect it. Survivorship graphs like this are helpful. This is the one I showed you earlier, the survivorship curve of ovicaprids from late Mylona 1A. Here I would like to place emphasis on the very top of this graph. You see that everything begins at the 70% of the herd. That means that before that, 30% had died already before the 6 months. What happened to these 30% of sheep and goats? These are probably the young animals which were slaughtered early on, very early on, so that people could get milk. And I show you this seal impression here. Milking was something that was actually practiced. And here is a nice picture of milking. Meat. Now, the importance of meat is a bit self-evident. Whenever we find bones in a domestic context, more likely than not, they testify meat eating. Many of them have these cut marks, which tell us a lot about how the carcasses were managed. In Neopalatial Mochlos, sheep and goat meat was consumed in every house of the settlement. We find the bones everywhere. The consumption was not as intense in every building. The intensity varied, but they are present everywhere. These primary waste depositions that I told you about tell us, however, that in some of the houses, the consumption of meat, of ovicaprids, was much more intense. Several animals were eaten in one episode, in one big commensal event, let's call it. And these buildings are the ones which are marked green. Wool, very important product of the sheep, and hair, what this lady is working on, very important product of the goats. We saw in the graphs earlier that wool and hair production was definitely an important business for the pastoralists around Mochlos in the late Mylona 1B. In the analysis, I tried to locate some castrates just to play with the model and see if we have all the elements of the model there. I didn't find any castrates, but how you can tell the castrates? The castrates have long bones which are wider, long bones like males. They have both the features of a male and female. They are long and wide. So if you plot the measurements of certain elements, like the metapodia, for example, the metacarpals, then you can see a group which are the males, a group which are the females, and a group in the center which are the castrates. We don't have that here. We cannot tell that. But in the herds, we have lots of very many females, 1 male for every 8 females. We saw the interest in wool and hair production in the late Minoan 1b, and we also saw the interest of the herders to increase their herds. Remember when I told you about the slaughtering of animals that had given birth at least once? And this is interesting because in the late Minoan 1b, we are just a few decades before the Mycenaean period. And I remind you that in the Mycenaean, sheep and to a lesser extent goats became a very big thing in the palatial economy with huge herds. And you need to have time to make these herds big. The question is, an interesting question is, what type of herds these animals that were consumed on Mochlos came from? There are 2 obvious options. In theory, they could have originated from 2 sources. They could be animals that were bred at the backyard on a small domestic scale. This is a standard practice, which is very well documented ethnographically, both in Crete and elsewhere. You keep a couple of animals at your backyard just for them to provide your family with milk, some meat every now and then, and whatever. At Mochlos, however, we have actually proof that some of the animals were living there. And the proof comes in the form of these teeth. These are 2 shed milk teeth of a sheep. These are shed when the animal is about 1 year of age, and they usually fall off at night when the animal ruminates. We found them in one of the houses at Mochlos. Now, Mochlos, remember the picture I showed you earlier, is a tiny place, very rocky, and almost covered with buildings. So there is not actually space there to keep a herd of animals, but there is space enough to keep a few animals there. So this scenario is quite plausible. But animals were bred in herds as well, on a more professional, let's say, manner, and that was a millennia-long tradition on Crete. Today I don't want to get into that argument whether there was transhumans on Crete and whether big herds were moved up and down the mountains, but here I will only say that the breeding of small or moderate size herds is perfectly compatible to cultivation, with only a small-scale movement to and from the wilderness around the settlement. And there is ample space for that in the area. This is an arrangement that provides precious manure for the fields off-season and an excellent recycling of resources. The Cretan coast across the Mochlos provides space for such an arrangement, and the various farmsteads which have been located and excavated along the Mirabello Bay coast might be part of such a system. Let's leave the ovicaprids, move on to pigs. Pig breeding could also be seen as an activity linked to the household in the late Minoan 1b, and that is based, as I told you earlier, on the fact that we find animals of all ages on site. The issue of cattle is more problematic. As I told you earlier, cattle meat was rarely consumed at Neopalatial Mochlos. Not all households had access to them, only the ones in blue circles. Only there we found a few cattle bones. There is evidence from elsewhere that cattle were milked. And also, cattle were used as working animal. And when cattle are used as working animal, then their bones, some of their bones, often get pathological. And these pathologies, like the ones I show you here, are very easily detectable archaeologically. In Knossos, actually, there have been found such bones which indicate the presence of cattle, the consumption of cattle, which used to be working animals. But here at Mochlos, we have none of these. Only a few animals at their prime ended up at the tables. And generally speaking, Neopalatial sites on East Crete have much fewer cattle remains than contemporary sites on the Western Crete. And this might be an indication that this was an area where breeding of cattle was not done systematically and on a large scale. Anyway, making a long story short, on this part of the island, near Mochlos, and based on evidence from Mochlos, it appears that we had a systematic and, let's say, professional breeding of sheep and goats that in the late Minoan 1b was linked to the production of wool and hair. In parallel, we also had a household-based breeding of these animals in a much smaller scale for the needs of the households. This household breeding might also have been true for pigs and cattle. But let's not forget that we are talking about a society which was highly stratified with palaces, central administration, and economic control of the primary production, agricultural and pastoral. How did Mochlos pastoralism fit in this broader scheme? Let's have a look at the written sources of the time, the linear A script on clay tablets and roundels from places like Aegean, Triada, Zakros, and Chania. Linear A has not been deciphered. However, the signs for animals, for some agricultural products and for numbers are very similar to those of linear B, so we are not completely at loss. A review of the records on domestic animals suggests that in the Neopalatial period, sheep were less important in the palatial sector of the economy than in the Mycenaean period, when sheep were a major branch of it. According to Ilse Schoep, livestock logograms are of low frequency. They occur in mixed commodities tablets, in specialized tablets, and in combined tablets, as well as on roundels. In the mixed commodities tablets, from Aegean, Triada, and Chania, for example, livestock are recorded with barley, figs, wine, and grapes. And in such tablets, where we have all these products, goats are more common than sheep. In the specialized tablets, from Zakros, for example, only sheep are mentioned. And while in other specialized tablets, as those from Aegean, Triada, all four sheep, goats, cattle, and pig are recorded. When all the animals are recorded, then the sheep logogram is more frequent than the goat one. And the number of animals is also larger. In other words, a range of possible combinations is recorded, not only one type of combination, but we have no idea why that was. The actual number of sheep and goats that were recorded is very low, especially compared to the linear B records where we have recordings for hundreds and thousands of animals. In the linear A, we have the numbers range from a couple to 12 to 15, somewhere there. Larger groups, for example, 100 animals, are very rare in the extant record. Among the recorded sheep, most are ewes, females of reproductive age. Rams are less common. And Ilse Schoep points out that the animal records in linear A tablets are similar to the sacrificial records of linear B tablets in the number of animals recorded. Leaving aside the issue of what was the palace's interest in animal husbandry in the Neopalatial period, there is one point which is of interest here. And that's the observation that each recorded small group of sheep was linked to different place names or to names of individuals, same as on the banqueting tablets of the linear B that I told you earlier. And the situation with goats is similar. Now, if we accept that a single producer or a single group of producers removed these animals, especially those small groups of animals, from their herds to give them to the palaces, we might assume that these animals represent a surplus fraction of the herd. That is, animals that were not necessary for the stability and the maintenance of the herd. Let's return back to Mochlos now. There we observe the exact same idea. A similar fraction of the herd, few animals, 10 animals, were removed from the herd and they were slaughtered and consumed in single episodes. In the late Mylona big kitchen space of house C3, for example, that I showed you earlier, there have been found concentrations of the bones of several sheep and goats, both young adults and mature adults. These appear to represent animals that had been slaughtered and consumed in a short period of time, and if its accumulation originated from a single herd, they probably represent a considerable fraction of these herds. The pattern, the similarities between what we see in the houses of Mochlos and what we read in the tablets is quite obvious. Now, based on these observations, we might suggest that these animals, the animals that we found consumed on Mochlos, on those depositions, represent in part this surplus fraction of the herds, and also the animals that were old enough and not useful anymore. And that's why they were eaten. It's interesting that some of the rich assemblages, such as the one from the house of the metal merchant, also included the remains of cattle and pig, echoing again the combination of animals in the mixed commodities tablets. But the economy of Neopalatial Mochlos had another aspect that was not part, as far as we know, of the palace-controlled economy. That was the exploitation of the marine resources. Consumption of fish and seafood was widespread across the settlement, and we find a certain amount and type of such remains everywhere on the site, in all buildings. It seems that pretty much everyone could go to the shore, pick some limpets, and cast a small net to catch a few damselfish. The situation is very different when we talk about the large fish of the deep. These were apparently consumed intensively in some households only, those in the purple circles. As I told you earlier, to catch these fish, you had to be a professional. You had to have learned the many skills involved. You had to know the morphology of these invisible depths. You had to know the habits of these invisible fish. You had to know how your tools work. You had to be able perhaps to make your own tools. You had to be able to navigate a boat, to be able not only to swim, but also to dive. Excavations in other contemporary sites illustrate all these activities. On Crete, for example, which is an island on the southern coast of Crete, there was a settlement that was specializing in purple dye production and also in other marine activities. And there, what I just told you is pretty obvious. Over there, you have a fishing community which trained its new members and where the new members learned all these things. It is quite possible that such a fishing community also existed, a fishing community of professional fishermen, also existed in the area of Mochlos. Perhaps this community was segregated in space. Perhaps professional fishermen lived elsewhere, not on the peninsula, at least its excavated part. And maybe that's why, the professional fishermen, and maybe that's why finds like this, fishing tools, are very rare finds in the houses of the settlement, despite the fact that we find such a rich record of marine foods. Access to the fruits of the labors of these professional fishermen was not for everyone, but for selected few, as I told you earlier. Please note on this site plan that how certain buildings stand out. these are the ones which have the most circles around them. These are the houses where all these unusual foods or special foods were consumed. They were not consumed everywhere. The inhabitants of these houses had a richer and more diverse diet, and they had access to uncommon food resources. And we might say that these people had also access to this professional sector of food production, being it fishing or animal herding. Let me finish here by summing up. In Neopalatial Mochlos, the production of animal foods moved on two different levels. On the one hand, we have large-scale production of terrestrial and marine animal foods on a professional level. These were activities tightly linked to the sphere of production of raw materials for the manufacture of a range of goods, many of them precious and exportable. The purple dye and the wool are two such examples. On the other hand, we have the low-intensity food production, being it the breeding of a pair of animals in your backyard or the picking of limpets from the rocks on the shore. Hunting of terrestrial animals does not play, it is not part of the picture. Access to food was not uniform among the various houses or households. All households seem to have had access to certain foods, especially those of low-intensity production, but only some of them had access to considerable amounts of the more systematically produced animal foods, being them red meat or large fish. Now, all these ideas and interpretations on the Mochlos faunal material are at the moment standing in isolation, so to speak. There are at the moment very few such large-scale, detailed published studies for other contemporary sites on Crete that would allow us to compare different choices and to discern repeated patterns. Thankfully, the last few years are witnessing a rather dramatic change of this, and several such publications are being prepared as we speak. So in a few years, I hope that the picture that I drew today will be much more nuanced and informed. And I finally finish by taking the opportunity to give my thanks to the Mochlos team, who spent many painstaking hours sorting tons of soil, washing and sorting tons of soil to collect all these thousands of bones and cells. I also thank Professor Jeffrey Scholz and my colleagues who helped me very much with preparing this presentation, both the contextualization and the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitra, for this analysis. I'm sure that there are lots of questions.
With all these animal bones on the floors of the houses, did these people ever clean house?
They did clean house. And actually, we have evidence that they did from other parts of the excavation and other periods. But that's why I made a point of it. What we find, these heaps of stuff, I think it's what was thrown on those floors just before the abandonment of the buildings. So we are lucky. We caught them in an untidy day.
I don't think you would expect any significant number of cattle. They didn't have the space or the resources to raise. At Mochlos.
Or the coast. But the coast across from Mochlos, in theory, it could be a good place for that. But
I mean, it takes a great deal of food and a great deal of water to raise cattle.
Yeah, that's
true. And a great deal of space. These things, I don't think were available in Mochlos.
Yeah, apparently they were not. And it makes a striking difference when you compare material from sites on Eastern Crete with those from Western Crete, Rethymno and Chania. Here you have percentages like 15–20% of cattle in any given assemblage, ordinary assemblages.
Are those houses where you found the special foods, deep water fish and cattle, somehow bigger or better than other houses?
They're bigger.
They're bigger.
They're bigger. And they have been recently excavated. So part of this picture is taphonomic. They have been recently excavated in detail, and we have done all the water flotation, etc. And the recording is very detailed. Some of the other houses had been excavated earlier. Some of them, for some of them, only few of their rooms were excavated. But still, the taphonomic reason behind the difference is valid up to a point. These houses are different for many reasons. I'm just talking about the animal bones here, but these are different for other reasons too.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dimitra. It was all very, very informative. Since you brought up now the taphonomic problem, I'm very interested about fish in particular, because as you mentioned already before, of course, there are taphonomic problems of, now you said about the flotation, what do they do, how do they recover them, but also for the smaller species, if they are eaten, all of that. So for you, how can you estimate what do you consider a lot of fish in a site versus not that much in another site? Based on what standards, based on your experience, what it says about that?
By comparing similar things. For example, from Mochlos, if I take the Neopalatial Mochlos and want to compare it with, let's say, the late Minoan 3 Mochlos, I wouldn't use all this material to make the comparison. I would take these special depositions out, because from the other phase, I only have material found in floors. The small stuff, which is so small that it gets into the floors, in the soil floors, it escapes in the corners of the room. So there is no point into comparing two such different things. I would compare the general scatter from the late Minoan, from the Neopalatial, with the general scatter of the late Minoan 3. It cannot be done. You have to be lucky to have this good preservation, and that's not very common.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Can you, since Professor Muley brought up water for cattle, what about I know you only found 2 freshwater mussels, but that's kind of an interesting detail and what it might say about rivers or streams on the island, on Crete?
Yeah, I told you half the story there. We have those freshwater mussels, but we also have some of the seashells, which are present in very low numbers, are mollusks which are found in brackish waters or in not too salty waters. And that tells us something about, that's an indication that they were picked in areas, in estuaries, for example, or in coastal lagoons. I don't know where that might have been in the area, but that's a story for the future. It needs to be investigated a bit more. But these freshwater mussels are not unique on Crete. They have been found elsewhere too, always in these low numbers, 1, 2 in every site.
Well, what about the trunculus finds? Are they the residues or whatever is left from the preparation of purple dye, or were they consumed after all?
Yeah, this is one part of the talk that I skipped because I forgot to tell you. In the settlement, we find 2 types of, the trunculus is this purple shell that I showed you. We found 2 types of them. We find complete shells everywhere. And those could very well have been food leftovers, because that's an edible mollusk. But in certain areas around the settlement, we found heaps of crushed shells of this type. Sometimes they are crushed very finely. And that's the case of leftovers from purple dye production, I think. They were brought as raw material on the site. And there are studies from elsewhere that the leftovers of purple dye production were used in lime production. The remains were burned to produce lime, and sometimes they were used as filler in plaster or for other applications. And I think that some of these piles of crushed purple cells were actually raw materials, and they were not related to food consumption. The more we look for this kind of stuff, the more sites we find where we have leftovers of purple dye production. We have very few excavated workshops still, but heaps of material is found everywhere. And I think you have some in Zakros, haven't you? In Karoumes, no. But that's piles of material, it's not a workshop. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that was very interesting. You brought the site so much alive. Thank you. I was interested by the what you mentioned about dog consumption. So, is that common in other sites in Crete?
It's not common, like it's common to eat pigs, but it's not uncommon either. There are several instances where we have evidence that dogs were eaten. We find dog bones with cut marks on them. We find them mixed up with ordinary food leftovers or burned. Like in this case, many of them were burned. Many of the dog bones were burned. So they were eaten. Their consumption was not a rare phenomenon, but I don't know how common it was. It's a bit difficult to quantify these things because we only rely on the leftovers that we happen to study and they happen to get published, so we know about them. So it's a matter of time. And if you ask that in 10 years' time, then I might be able to tell you more about it. 10 years before, we had much fewer cases than what we have now.
Thank you.
Talking about sheep and goats, if I understood you correctly, they were kept mostly for meat in one period and then mostly for milk in the next one.
For wool in the next one.
Yeah. Why would this change? Have you any explanation for this?
That's a big question. I'm not in a position to tell you now, but I think this is something. This is the real interesting question behind all this analysis. Why this change happened? I told you at the beginning that the Neopalatial was a period of changes. Lots of things happened, many of them very dramatic things. How this relates to the change of economic priorities, I don't know yet.
Okay.
Στοιχεία αν έχετε δεδομένα από προηγούμενες περιόδους στο Μόχλο. Αν υπάρχουν δηλαδή κατάλοιπα ζωοαρχαιολογικά.
Παλιότερες περιόδους.
Ναι.
Ο Μόχλος είναι μια διαχρονική θέση και υπάρχουν στοιχεία για διάφορες περιόδους. Το πρόβλημα είναι ότι για να κάνεις αυτού του είδους την ανάλυση για την ηλικία σφαγής και τη διαχείριση των κοπαδιών, χρειάζεται να έχεις αρκετά στοιχεία ώστε το δείγμα σου να είναι στατιστικά κάπως σοβαρό. Δηλαδή, αν έχεις 5 κόκαλα που μπορείς να προσδιορίσεις την ηλικία τους, εκεί απλώς περιγραφικά λες έχω νεαρά ή έχω ενήλικα, αλλά δεν μπορείς να μιλήσεις για τάσεις με έναν τρόπο που να είναι στατιστικά έτσι κάπως αξιόπιστος. Και αυτή είναι η περίπτωση στο Μόχλο. Για άλλες περιόδους έχουμε στοιχεία, αλλά είναι πολύ μικρά τα δείγματα. Γι' αυτό σας είπα προηγουμένως ότι περιμένω πώς και πώς να αρχίσουν να βγαίνουν και άλλες μελέτες που υπάρχουν και που άλλες είναι στη διαδικασία να βγουν όπου να είναι, άλλες γράφονται τώρα. Θα έχει πολύ ενδιαφέρον νομίζω αυτό, το να μπορούμε να έχουμε αρκετά στοιχεία.
Διαχρονικά.
Ναι, και διαχρονικά, αλλά και σε έκταση, να το δει από περιοχή σε περιοχή τι γίνεται. Γιατί, ας πούμε, ο Μόχλος είναι μια θέση που δεν έχει ανάκτορο, λέμε τώρα. Δίπλα είναι τα γουρνιά, μια θέση που έχουν ανάκτορο. Πώς συγκρίνονται αυτές οι δύο, αυτό θα ήταν πολύ ενδιαφέρον να δει κανείς.
Δηλαδή, μου λέτε αμέσως ότι τα στοιχεία είναι πολύ λίγα, έτσι, από την πρώιμη εποχή του
Από το Μόχλο, ναι, είναι λίγα.
Ή τη μέση.
Ναι, ναι.
Well, the wine and snacks are waiting.
Λοιπόν, να σας ευχαριστήσω και εγώ όλους. Να ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ το Συνδικό Ινστιτούτο. Thank you, Arto, again, for a very fruitful collaboration in these Aegean lectures. Because this one is the last Aegean lecture in the Swedish Institute for this winter. We're coming back in October. But next month, actually it's not next month, it's on the 2nd of June, we will have our final Aegeus lecture for this year at the annual of the Aegeus at the British School at Athens. And we're expecting you all there, as every year the lecture will be from Professor John Bennett on Linear B. I don't know the exact title, but it will be on this topic. And of course, afterwards, we will have our garden party with also the lottery, and you have the ability to win this great trip to Santorini. So please come, Thursday, 2nd of June. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dimitra.